Someone playing nurse might want to find work more suited to her capabilities before security has to escort her out. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 90 minutes before the SEAL commander's heart stopped beating. Elena Martinez moves through St. Michael's ICU in San Diego like a shadow, checking vitals, charting medications, her hand steady despite the tremor in her left wrist from old shrapnel wounds. She carries a tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, rolling it between her fingers during quiet moments when the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical lullaby above the patient beds. The coin is the size of a quarter, worn smooth by 7 years of nervous habit, engraved on one side with a unique callsign she will never speak aloud in this hospital, Third Fleet Warfare. The glass partition of the conference room is transparent but might as well be a wall. Elena stands outside it during grand rounds, updating the medication cart with fresh for supplies while Dr. Caldwell uses her as a cautionary example to the residents gathered around him like disciples. His voice carries the particular condescension reserved for those he considers beneath him, dripping with practiced disdain as he gestures toward the glass without naming her directly, criticizing the nurses who overreach their competence and personnel with delusions about their clinical authority. The residents smirk in her direction. One of them, a young man with the kind of soft hands that have never held anything heavier than a pen, actually laughs. Elena does not flinch. She does not turn. She continues arranging medication vials with the precision of someone who has assembled weapons systems under fire. Her jaw locks once, a tiny muscle spasm near her left temple, but her hands remain steady on the cart. The tremor in her wrist is old, shrapnel from an IED blast in Fallujah, a wound that never appears on any civilian medical record. Pain is information. That is what her commanding officer taught her. Pain tells you where you are still alive. Later, at the vending machine near the pharmacy, Caldwell finds her alone. He stands close enough that she can smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, the scent of a man who believes proximity equals dominance. His voice is quiet now, which is somehow worse than the public mockery. Quiet voices carry threats that echo longer. "I notice you've been spending a lot of time in room 347, he says. His fingers drum against the vending machine. The SEAL patient. The one who's essentially vegetative. That's not typical for floor nursing, is it? Elena does not answer. She feeds a dollar bill into the slot. The machine hums. You seem invested in his care, Caldwell continues. Almost like you know him personally. That's concerning. Professional boundaries matter, Elena. Or do I have to tell you that? He steps closer. His shadow falls across her face. Someone with your limitations might want to find work more suited to her actual capabilities. Before security has to get involved in a difficult conversation. Do you understand? It is not a question. The threat is constructed with surgical precision, not direct enough to report, specific enough that she feels the weight of his institutional power. Caldwell knows the board members. Caldwell plays golf with a nursing board investigator every Thursday. Caldwell has recommendations that matter. Elena presses the button for black coffee. The machine whirs and dispenses it without steam. Cold. She watches the cup fill. I understand, doctor, she says. Her voice is quiet, deferential, the voice of a nurse who accepts her place in the hierarchy. The voice of someone with something to lose. Caldwell nods, satisfied that he has established dominance. He walks away, his shoes clicking against the tile with the rhythm of a man who has never questioned his own authority. What Caldwell does not understand, what he cannot possibly understand, is that Elena's meticulous charting over the past 6 months has documented a pattern in the medical supply orders that crosses the line from profitable into criminal. She has cross-referenced invoice numbers from Caldwell's preferred vendor against actual equipment deliveries. The hospital pays $14,000 for a level 1 rapid infuser that arrives. Caldwell's vendor bills for 3 units. 2 never ship. The discrepancy repeats across different equipment types: ventilators, cardiac monitors, crash carts, infusion pumps. The hospital is being billed triple for supplies that exist only on paper. A pattern only visible to someone trained to recognize supply chain fraud during wartime logistics. A pattern only obvious to someone who spent 8 years with the Naval Supply Systems Command before this nursing assignment. Elena knows this. Caldwell does not. That asymmetry is everything. She returns to room 347 with the cold coffee balanced in one hand and a fresh medication chart in the other. The commander lies in the bed with the stillness of deep unconsciousness, his muscular frame diminished by 2 weeks of paralytic medication and mechanical ventilation. An 18-gauge for runs into his left antecubital fossa. The ventilator cycles with its rhythmic whoosh, pushing oxygenated air into his lungs at 12 breaths per minute. His chest rises and falls like waves nobody asked for. Elena pulls the sheet back and checks the placement of his central line catheter, the triple-lumen PICC line running to his right subclavian vein. The insertion site is clean, no signs of infection or infiltration. She documents this in the paper chart: no erythema, no swelling. Dressing dry and intact. Patient remains unresponsive to verbal and tactile stimulus. Then she looks at his forearm. At the tattoo. Block letters, black ink, the kind of permanent marking that means something specific in the military. His name. But not his rank name. The name the men on his team called him. Martinez. He had it done during shore leave in 2017, after Fallujah, after everything changed. She remembers the conversation, drinking in a bar in San Diego, his voice hoarse from a partially collapsed lung that still hadn't fully expanded, him saying he wanted to remember who had dragged him half a kilometer through the Jolan district toward the extraction bird while his blood painted the dirt. She had told him it was a terrible idea. A permanent record of a classified operation. A name that connects him to someone who doesn't exist in any official capacity. He had done it anyway. Elena sets down her coffee on the bedside table and adjusts his ventilator settings. Nothing needs adjusting, but she needs something to do with her hands besides touch his arm. The commander's eyes remain closed. His EEG showed moderate activity 2 days ago, brainstem reflexes intact, some hope of neurological recovery despite the traumatic brain injury from the blast. But recognition is different from survival. Recognition is the kind of recovery that takes more than medicine. She presses the challenge coin in her pocket. The metal warms against her palm. On its other side, engraved in letters so small most people would miss them, is a latitude and longitude, the coordinates of a forward operating base near Fallujah where something happened that never appeared in any official report. There are exactly 5 doctors at St. Michael's who could order a neurological clearance for the commander. Caldwell is one of them. The others are Dr. Morrison, Dr. Patel, Dr. Nguyen, and Dr. Reeves. Of those 5, Caldwell controls for through direct friendship or financial obligation. She has watched him coordinate with Morrison over golf. She has observed him recommending Patel for the hospital's most prestigious committee. She has documented Reeves accepting a consulting fee from Caldwell's vendor arrangement, $50,000 deposited into an offshore account registered under Reeves's brother-in-law's name. Nguyen is the only one independent. The only one who cannot be leveraged. But that is not Caldwell's concern tonight. His concern is that Elena has seen too much, knows too much, and remains positioned exactly where she needs to be to document everything. A threat he is about to neutralize with the same calculated precision he uses for everything else. Elena checks the commander's pupils one final time, equal, round, reactive to the penlight she keeps on her badge. She moves through the assessment with the kind of automatic precision that comes from muscle memory itself coming from training that was never supposed to exist in a civilian hospital. Her hands move on their own. Her voice, when she whispers, carries a frequency so low the commander cannot hear it through the haze of sedatives, but her own nervous system knows what she is saying. Stay with me, Master Chief. I see you. You're not invisible. Not here. Not yet. She presses the coin one more time and steps back from the bed, leaving her hand on the rail for exactly 3 seconds, a contact she will pay for when Caldwell discovers this gesture is not part of standard nursing protocol. But the assignment requires it. Naval intelligence requires her presence in this room, documenting not just the commander's recovery but any visitors, any calls, any indication of who might want him dead or silent. And Dr. Caldwell, with his expensive cologne and his institutional power and his fabricated supply chain, has no idea that the woman he just threatened at the vending machine is tracking him with the same precision she once used to track insurgents through Fallujah. But that wasn't the worst part. What Caldwell also didn't know was what would happen when the commander's heart stopped beating at 0200 hours, and four other physicians stood together in the trauma bay, all of them ready to document time of death while a Master Chief Petty Officer stood holding a pericardiocentesis kit and the weight of 7 years of invisible service. Grand rounds at St. Michael's happened every Thursday at 1400 hours, a ritual as rigid as morning colors at a naval base. 15 residents sat in the 4th-floor conference room with 3 attending physicians, their laptops open, their attention supposedly focused on the case presentation Dr. Caldwell was delivering with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned. Elena stood in the corridor outside the glass wall, pushing her medication cart in a pattern that kept her visible, checking vitals, restocking supplies, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who had nowhere else to be. She had done this rounds routine 100 times. The doctors didn't notice nurses in corridors. They looked through them, past them, into their own reflections on glass. Caldwell stood at the front of the room, adjusting the presentation slide to show a case study, a patient with an acute complication, a clinical decision made at the bedside, an outcome that could have been catastrophic. His voice carried through the glass wall easily. He had trained himself to project authority, to fill a room the way rank-conscious officers do. This case demonstrates a fundamental problem we see with increasing regularity, Caldwell said, gesturing toward the slide. Clinical overreach. When individuals without the requisite training attempt to perform tasks beyond their competence, they don't just risk their license. They risk lives. Elena didn't stop moving. Her hands remained steady on the medication cart, fingers precisely organizing 4 bags and syringes into her delivery sequence. She had learned composure before she learned to read. 3 tours through Fallujah taught you that showing emotion was a liability. Your face was a weapon you gave the enemy if you weren't careful. Specifically, Caldwell continued, turning slightly to look through the glass wall directly at her while maintaining the pretense of addressing the residents, when nurses confuse television drama with actual clinical judgment, when they believe their bedside observations matter more than physician assessment, we get situations like this. He gestured again, more deliberately this time, his hand rising as his eyes found her through the glass. One of the residents, a woman with a sharp chin and sharper attention to detail, turned in her chair to follow his gaze. Then another. Then 3 more. The smirking started quietly, a sound like wind moving through a canyon, building in volume as understanding spread through the room. Elena felt the weight of 18 sets of eyes, but her expression didn't change. Her jaw locked down, a physical choice, the same way a soldier locks breathing during sniper fire. She pulled a chart from her cart, flipped a page, consulted it with the intensity of someone reading the most critical information in existence when really she was seeing nothing but the white space between printed lines. Her knuckles had whitened slightly on the cart handle, but she maintained the movement pattern. Step forward. Adjust supplies. Look down. Step forward again. The meditation of routine. Confidence without competence, Caldwell was saying, his voice taking on the measured tone of a teacher addressing slow students, is perhaps the most dangerous thing in medicine. It looks like expertise. It sounds like authority. But underneath, it's just someone who doesn't know what they don't know. He let that land for 3 seconds. The residents were fully attentive now, some taking notes, one whispering to her neighbor with an expression Elena recognized as contempt. This was what Caldwell needed, an audience for his philosophy, witnesses to his intellectual superiority, proof that he understood the hierarchy in ways that the younger doctors needed to understand. The presentation continued for another 8 minutes. Elena did 2 full medication cart rotations past the conference room glass, never stopping, never looking directly at Caldwell, never giving him the reaction his performance demanded. Her presence in the corridor was the point of the whole exercise, and denying him her visible shame was the only power she had left. At 15:30, she was at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, reaching for a bottle of water, when she felt the air pressure change behind her. That was the first warning, not sound, not sight, but the physical shift that happens when a large entity moves through space with deliberate slowness. She knew before she turned that it would be Caldwell. Of course it would be. He stood close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively male, the scent of a man who had learned to occupy space by making others uncomfortable. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. "You know, Martinez, I've been thinking," he said, and there was a smile in his voice that had nothing to do with happiness. 3 other nurses were visible at the far end of the hallway, pretending not to listen while their bodies remained absolutely still. Elena extracted her water bottle from the machine. Her movements were methodical, unhurried. Pull. Release. Retrieve. She didn't respond. "This hospital serves actual professionals," Caldwell continued, his voice pitched just loud enough for the other nurses to hear every syllable. "People with the right training, the right judgment, the right credentials. Maybe someone with your limited skill set would be happier somewhere else. Urgent care, perhaps? A clinic? Somewhere playing nurse doesn't put actual lives at risk." He leaned in slightly, and Elena caught the smell of his aftershave mixed with coffee, the animal reek of a predator that had never encountered real resistance. "Of course, if you'd prefer, I could help you understand these limitations personally. My office has very comfortable seating." The implications hung there like surgical retractors, opening up the space between them, making it clear that compliance with his authority could happen in many ways. Elena turned to face him. Her eyes were the color of winter Atlantic water, a gray so flat and so empty that it seemed to reflect nothing, absorb nothing, care about nothing. She had looked at men like Caldwell before, across different environments, with different uniforms and different weapons. The expression she wore now was the same one she had used during deposition interviews with lawyers who thought they could break her testimony. "Excuse me, doctor," she said quietly. Her voice had dropped half an octave, a physical recalibration that made it clear this was not the voice of someone asking permission. She stepped forward with a kind of deliberate movement that made Caldwell shift his weight backward, and she passed directly through the space he had been occupying. The water bottle was still cold in her grip. She walked to the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a small room filled with linens and equipment, the kind of space that nobody else ever entered. The door closed behind her. Her hands began to shake then, tremors running from her wrists up through her forearms in the way that fear moves when you finally stop holding it back. She stood very still, breathing in the antiseptic smell of cleaned fabric, her fingers gripping the edge of a supply shelf while her shoulders remained rigid. But that wasn't the worst part. At 16:20, Caldwell found her outside room 347, where the commander lay in his medically induced coma, unaware that the woman checking his vitals had already saved his life once and would likely have to do it again. The CNO, the chief nursing officer, a woman named Patricia who had once been an actual nurse before she learned that administration was more profitable than patient care, stood beside him like a silent witness to whatever was about to happen. "Ms. Martinez," Caldwell said, and his voice had shifted to something almost gentle, the tone a lawyer uses when they're closing a trap they've spent hours constructing. "We've had some concerns about medication handling. Just so we're clear, one more documented irregularity and security will be escorting you out. We can't have liability risks walking our floors." He glanced at Patricia, who nodded with the kind of sympathy that came from someone who had already written the termination letter in her head. Elena's chart was in her hands. She looked at it, then at Caldwell, then back at the chart. When she spoke, her voice was entirely flat, not deferential, not angry, but completely emptied of any emotional content whatsoever. "Understood, doctor." She moved past him with the same deliberate precision she had used at the vending machine, and continued down the corridor to her next patient. What Caldwell didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand because his entire existence had been built on the assumption that people like Elena Martinez could be broken by humiliation and threat, was that she had already been broken. 7 years ago, in Fallujah, during a patrol through the Jolan district, an IED had detonated beneath a Humvee carrying the man now in room 347. Elena had run through sniper fire to reach him. She had pulled shrapnel from his body with her bare hands, applied field tourniquets while rounds snapped past her head, and stayed with him for 2 kilometers of running and crawling until the extract bird came down. She had already seen the worst thing that could happen to a human body. She had already looked into death's actual face and told it no. What Caldwell also didn't know, what his entire worldview had been constructed to prevent him from ever knowing, was that Elena's meticulous charting, her careful documentation of every medication, every procedure, every clinical decision, had already exposed something that terrified him far more than any employment board ever could. She had been logging discrepancies in the medical supply inventory for 6 months. Equipment ordered but never delivered. Invoices paid to vendors who didn't exist. Charges marked up by 350% on supplies that somehow disappeared before they ever reached the hospital floor. The hospital was losing money on every order. Caldwell was making money on every gap between the paperwork and reality. He had threatened her because he was afraid. He had humiliated her in front of the residents because fear makes people loud. He had brought the CNO to witness her warning because he needed institutional cover for what he was planning to do next, and Elena knew what that meant. Fabricated errors. Documented medication irregularities that would appear in her file like shadows. A state nursing board investigator who owed Caldwell favors, who would make phone calls to the right people, who would ask the right questions designed to generate the right answers. He was going to destroy her credentials before her documentation could destroy his financial scheme. She returned to the nurse's station at 16:45 and pulled up the commander's chart on her terminal. His vitals were stable. His medication schedule was correct. His neurological assessment showed no change, still non-responsive, still lost somewhere in the space between consciousness and whatever void the IED blast had created. She charted her observations with the same precision she had been using since the moment she arrived at St. Michael's, exact times, exact readings, exact details. The chart was her witness now. The chart was the only voice that would matter. The challenge coin she kept in her scrub pocket, the one the commander had given her in Fallujah, worn smooth by 17 years of hands and worn thin by the knowledge that it represented the only promise that had ever actually mattered, felt heavier than usual against her ribs. She didn't remove it. She didn't need to look at it. She already knew what it meant. It meant that people who were willing to die didn't stop fighting just because someone threatened their employment. It meant that broken people sometimes found their strength in the worst possible circumstances. It meant that Caldwell had just miscalculated something fundamental about the woman he was trying to destroy. The shift stretched into evening. Elena completed her medication rounds. She checked on 7 other patients. She helped a resident interpret an EKG. She answered call bells and documented everything with the kind of obsessive precision that would later become the evidence against Caldwell himself. The hospital moved around her with its own rhythm, monitors beeping, shoes clicking on tile, the soft whoosh of automatic doors opening and closing. She was part of the machinery now, indispensable and invisible, the kind of person that hospitals ran on without ever acknowledging her existence. But at 2300 hours, when she finally clocked out and walked to her car in the parking lot, when she sat alone in the dark with her hands on the steering wheel, that was when the reality of what was coming began to settle into her bones like infection. Caldwell had already set the machinery in motion. She could feel it the way you can feel a storm coming, the pressure change, the shift in air currents, the way animals know that something is about to become dangerous. By this time tomorrow, there would be fabricated incident reports. By the end of the week, there would be board meetings. By the end of the month, she would be unemployed and under investigation for violations that never happened. And the commander would be left with 5 doctors who had already decided he wasn't worth saving. The monitor alarm shrieked at 0200 hours like a trauma bird inbound with a wounded soldier. Elena was 3 corridors away, restocking the medication cart outside the ICU, when the sound cut through her sternum like a blade. She didn't run. Running meant panic, meant the whole floor would know before she even reached room 347. She walked instead, measured, precise, her boots silent on the tile because Master Chief Petty Officers don't announce their movements. They arrive. The rest of the world notices later. The commander's pressure was dropping. She saw it on the monitor from the doorway before her hand touched the frame, 88/54 sliding down the numbers like a soldier losing consciousness. 82/51. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing oxygen into lungs that should have been fighting back by now. His chest rose. His chest fell. The electrical activity on the screen traced mountains and valleys, peaks and troughs, the heart still trying, still contracting, but the fluid around it was compressing like a hand closing around a throat. Cardiac tamponade. The pressure building in the pericardial sac, the fibrous tissue surrounding the heart, squeezing, suffocating, killing. She knew the cascade because she had lived it in the field 7 years ago in Fallujah when a fragmentation round from an IED tore through the chest cavity of the man in that bed, and she had compressed his sternum with both hands while rounds snapped overhead and the rotor wash from the extract bird shook the entire compound. She knew the look on a man's face when he was dying. She knew the weight of him going slack. She knew the sound of his last breath before the medic's hands became the only thing keeping him from crossing over. The challenge coin was still in her scrub pocket from the morning. She had touched it twice, once at 0600 when she started her shift, once more at 0930 when Caldwell had walked past the med station with his eyes locked on her like a predator calculating whether prey was worth pursuing. The inscription on that coin read, "Never quit. Never surrender." Written in lettering so fine you could barely feel it with your thumb. Pressed there by the commander's own hand in a forward operating base where dust storms turned day into twilight and mortar round sounded like the world splitting open. She paged cardiology at 0202. Dr. Morrison picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. "What's the call?" "Room 347. SEAL Commander. Pressure dropping. Possible tamponade. 7 words. No elaboration." "No, please." Dr. Morrison understood. Elena could hear him moving already, the rustle of sheets, the thud of feet hitting the floor. 2 minutes, he said. She believed him. Morrison was one of the good ones, a former army surgeon who understood that sometimes the nurse in the room had information worth trusting. 90 seconds. That was her standard. If cardiology wasn't moving fast enough, 90 seconds was the gap between savable and unsalvageable. The mathematics of dying. She assembled the pericardiocentesis kit while the alarm continued its shriek, her hands moving through muscle memory developed across 4 continents and 12 years of keeping people alive when keeping them alive required breaking every rule about hierarchy and authority. The 18-gauge needle. The syringe. The flutter valve. The chlorhexidine prep pads with their chemical smell like copper and industrial disinfectant. She laid them out in sequence on the sterile field, her movements precise as a liturgy, each instrument placed exactly where her muscle memory expected it. The commander's BP was 76/48 now. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia, the heart rate climbing past 130, past 140, the body's last-ditch effort to compensate for a pump that was being strangled. His oxygen sat was still adequate because the ventilator didn't care about cardiac output, only about delivering breaths into compliant lungs. For now. Another 5 minutes of this and even good lungs would start to fail. Another 10 minutes and he would be gone. At 0203, Dr. Caldwell walked through the door with 4 physicians trailing behind him like a funeral procession. Dr. Morrison. Dr. Patel. Dr. Nguyen. Dr. Reeves. 5 doctors. All of them looking at the monitor, all of them reading the cascade of declining numbers, and all of them arriving at the same conclusion Elena could see forming behind their eyes like a decision being stamped in slow motion. "He's not salvageable," Caldwell said. No period at the end of his words. A statement of fact delivered the way surgeons deliver diagnoses, flat, final, without the burden of doubt. Profound cardiogenic shock secondary to tamponade. Core organs are already underperfused. Intervention at this point is just prolonging suffering. Dr. Reeves was already moving toward the chart, a pen in his hand. Already documenting the time of death, the clinical reasoning, the medical decision that this man, this SEAL commander with his name tattooed in block letters on Elena's forearm, this man whose blood had soaked into her flight suit in Fallujah when she dragged him half a kilometer under fire, this man who had taught her how to shoot a pistol while standing on a rooftop in a combat zone where the horizon was always orange, this man was not worth the attempt. Dr. Patel looked away. She did that sometimes, the compassionate ones, when they couldn't find the strength to argue against consensus. Dr. Nguyen checked his watch. Dr. Morrison opened his mouth and then closed it again, the calculus of hospital politics playing out in real time. Cardiology could fight one battle, but 5 doctors agreeing was a wall even Morrison couldn't breach. "Step away from the patient, Martinez," Caldwell said. Not a request. The tone of a man accustomed to obedience, accustomed to nurses stepping when he pointed, moving when he gestured, disappearing when he required their absence. She was already at the bedside with the chlorhexidine prep pad in one hand, landmarking the xiphoid process with her other hand, finding that anatomical reference point where the lower border of the rib cage met the breastbone, that exact location where the needle would enter with the least resistance and the greatest chance of accessing the pericardial sac without hitting the internal mammary artery or lacerating the right ventricle. "I said move, Martinez. Now." The 5 doctors were already turning. That was the moment she saw it most clearly, the collective pivot toward the door, the physical withdrawal of authority, the abandonment written into their body language. They were walking away from a man they had decided was already dead. They were leaving the room to the nurse who somehow had not yet received the memo about futility and acceptance. Elena was steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the weight of every protocol she was about to violate, every hierarchy she was about to dismantle, every consequence she was about to invite. The voice in her head that sounded like her commanding officer in the Navy said, "This is sedition. This is insubordination. This is how careers end." And her hands moved anyway because hands that had held living people together when everything else was falling apart don't stop just because a doctor said stop. The needle went in at 45 degrees, perpendicular to the skin, advancing through tissue planes with the kind of resistance that told her she was in the right place. She felt the give when the needle pierced the pericardium, that membrane surrounding the heart, and then the slight catch of resistance as she advanced past it into the pericardial space. She had done this twice in her life. Once in Fallujah. Once in a simulation center at Naval Medical San Diego. Never in a civilian hospital with 5 attending physicians walking out the door. The syringe attached. The plunger pulled back. Blood filled the barrel, 60 ccs of straw-colored fluid mixed with darker blood, the accumulation of bleeding into the space around the heart, the fluid that was crushing the organ like a hand closing around a throat. She withdrew steadily, her grip steady as surgical laser, 60 ccs of pure pressure relief draining back into the syringe. The commander gasped. His whole body convulsed like he was waking from a dream about drowning. His oxygen sat jumped from 89 to 94. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 118. His blood pressure climbed, 88/52. Then 92/58. Then 94/60, the number that meant he was coming back. The number that meant Elena had just saved his life a second time, here in this hospital room with 5 doctors already documenting his death in the hallway outside. She withdrew the needle. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She was already moving toward the monitor to log the time, already reaching for the dressing to secure the needle site, already becoming the nurse that nobody in this hospital understood they were standing next to. The commander's eyes were still closed. The sedation was still working. He had no idea who had just reached into the Reaper's hand and dragged him backward toward the living. But Dr. Caldwell knew. She saw him through the window, saw him stop in the hallway, saw his face shift from the calm of moral certainty to something sharper and more dangerous. He had expected her to obey. He had expected her to step away from the patient and let 5 doctors make a decision that would remove the only obstacle to his continued theft and fraud. What he was seeing now, a nurse who had performed an emergency procedure with the precision of someone trained for exactly this, was a threat that could not be tolerated. He was already reaching for his phone. By 0600 hours, the commander's pressure had climbed to 102/68. Stable. His pupils reactive. The pericardial fluid drained from his sac was already being sent to the lab, and Elena had documented every measurement, every step, every second of the timeline in the medical record with the precision of someone who understood that paper trails were the only protection she had left. She didn't know it was already too late. The page came through her phone at 0645. Report to Dr. Caldwell's office immediately. Not a request. Not a courtesy. The kind of summons that arrived with the weight of institutional authority behind it, the kind that made nurses straighten their scrubs and check their badges before walking. The hallway to the administrative corridor felt longer than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, and Elena's rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the polished tile. She had walked these halls for 3 years and never once had she been called to that office. She had never been called to any office. She had simply been Elena Martinez, the quiet nurse on the cardiac unit who asked good questions and charted with obsessive detail and kept her military service to herself because there was a safety in invisibility that people like her had learned to value. The office door was open. Dr. Caldwell sat behind an expensive mahogany desk with 3 manila folders arranged in front of him like evidence at a trial. His face was composed, but there was something in his eyes that told Elena everything she needed to know. This man had been cornered and was now fighting the only way he knew how. With paperwork. With allies. With the apparatus of institutional power that had always protected men like him. "Close the door," he said. Not looking at her. Just those 3 words, delivered the way a surgeon might deliver an order to prep the OR. Elena closed the door behind her. The office smelled like expensive cologne and something else underneath it, the faint copper scent of anxiety, the chemical signature of a man's cortisol response when his carefully constructed world began to crumble. She had learned to read those smells in combat. Fear smelled the same in every uniform. "You performed an unauthorized procedure last night," Caldwell said, opening the first folder. "Without physician supervision. Without proper consent from the patient or his next of kin. You also documented a medication discrepancy in our supply records 3 weeks ago, this one here," he turned the folder so Elena could see it, "where you claim that 15 units of epinephrine were unaccounted for in the pharmacy requisition. This is a direct allegation of either theft or negligence on my part." Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was a weapon. Words were ammunition you could never get back. Silence was a fortress. "I've also discovered," Caldwell continued, his voice taking on that false professorial tone he used during grand rounds, "that you have been accessing the commander's room outside of normal care protocols. His chart notes show you've been checking his vitals at 0300 hours, 0400 hours, irregular times. This represents a pattern of conduct that suggests an inappropriate personal relationship rather than professional nursing care." He opened the second folder. "I have statements from 2 residents who observed this behavior. The lies were constructed with surgical precision. A kernel of truth, yes, she had checked the commander's vitals at odd hours, twisted into something sinister. Something that painted her not as a dedicated nurse but as someone unfit for the profession." Elena felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her face blank. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. "There's one more thing," Caldwell said, and now his voice dropped lower, more intimate, the tone of a man sharing a confidence. "The procedure you performed last night. That pericardiocentesis. Excellent technique, actually. Almost professional. But that's precisely the problem." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You performed an invasive procedure on a patient who was legally determined to be unsalvageable by 5 board-certified physicians. When 5 doctors make a determination like that, there's a liability question. There's a question about who authorized that intervention." Elena understood then. She understood completely. He was going to blame her for what he had ordered the 5 doctors to declare. He was going to use the very act of saving the commander's life as the instrument of her destruction. "I have 3 board members who are prepared to recommend your immediate termination," Caldwell said, his voice taking on that tone of regret, the tone of a man delivering bad news he deeply wished he didn't have to deliver. "Margaret Chen, Robert Torres, and David Hutchins. All of them have been briefed. I also have a statement from the CNO. You know her daughter, Lisa, got into Johns Hopkins Medical School. I wrote that recommendation. Personal letter, actually. Very detailed." He smiled. There was no warmth in it. And I have contact with Dr. James Reeves from the State Nursing Board Investigation Unit. He and I golf together every Thursday at Torrey Pines. He understands the seriousness of these allegations. The network was laid out like a chess board, and Elena could see every move already made. 3 board members who owed him professional debts. 1 administrator who owed him a family favor. 1 regulator who owed him friendship. All of them positioned to testify that Elena Martinez had exceeded her scope of practice, had fabricated evidence of supply fraud, and had compromised patient care through unauthorized procedures. And underneath it all, Elena understood the real reason. She had documented his fraud. Her charts, her careful notes about missing supplies and irregular requisitions, had created a paper trail that connected directly back to him. A termination would effectively silence her. A termination would remove her access to the commander's room. A termination would compromise the classified naval intelligence operation she was running, monitoring the commander for potential security breaches, tracking who knew about his patrol route in Fallujah, identifying which members of his team had leaked information to insurgents that had nearly gotten him killed. Your termination is effective immediately, Caldwell said, sliding a termination letter across the desk. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You're not to access any patient records or protected areas. You're not to speak with any patients or staff members about the circumstances of your separation. If you do, we will pursue legal action for breach of confidentiality and defamation of character. Elena picked up the termination letter. Her hands were steady. The letter was dated 0800 hours. By the time she walked out of that office, it would be official. By the time security escorted her from the building, her access codes would be disabled. By the time she reached her car in the parking lot, she would no longer be employed at St. Michael's Medical Center, San Diego. The commander would be alone. The intelligence operation would be compromised. The fraud would go uninvestigated. And 5 doctors would never face consequences for declaring a savable patient dead. Elena walked out of the office without speaking. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She did not give Caldwell the satisfaction of watching her break. She simply turned and walked back down the hallway, past the nurse's station where colleagues looked up with sudden understanding, past the supply closet where she had hidden medication during her worst moments, past the break room where she had eaten 100 lonely lunches watching the cardiac monitors on the small television in the corner. By 0800 she was cleaning out her locker. Her stethoscope went into a cardboard box. The framed photograph of Miguel at his high school graduation went in next. A challenge coin, tarnished, ancient, given to her in Fallujah by the commander 7 years ago, went in last. She turned it over in her hand one final time before dropping it in the box. The coin was the weight of a lie. She carried her own history in her pocket and nobody would ever know. Security escorted her to her car. A guard whose name she didn't know, who walked 3 steps behind her without speaking, who understood the protocol but not the cost. By 0930 she was home in her small apartment in Ocean Beach, sitting at a kitchen table with cold coffee, wondering if this was what compromise felt like. At 3 a.m. she couldn't sleep. She drove back to Harbor Drive to a diner that never closed, a place where insomniacs and night shift workers came to stare into the fluorescent distance. She ordered coffee that she didn't drink. The window beside her table reflected her own face back at herself, hollow-eyed and gaunt, the kind of hollow that comes from knowing you've been erased. From knowing that in saving the commander's life, you destroyed your own cover. The question that kept turning over in her mind, the question that her hands kept clenching around, was whether saving his life twice would be enough to justify losing everything else. Whether the 3 rounds of gunfire she'd taken for him in Fallujah, the shrapnel she'd carried in her left shoulder and right calf, the promotion she'd turned down because they would have brought her out of field operations, whether any of that mattered now that she was sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning drinking coffee she didn't want. The hospital had fired her. The commander still didn't recognize her face. And nobody in the entire city of San Diego knew that Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez was pushing a medication cart on the 7th floor of St. Michael's Medical Center, documenting fraud, running classified intelligence operations, and quietly saving lives that 5 doctors had already declared dead. Elena was halfway through her locker when the fluorescent lights above her cast everything in a sickly yellow wash that made her skin look like old parchment. Security walked 3 paces behind her, protocol for terminated employees, as if she might suddenly decide to steal narcotics or access a patient file. Her civilian clothes felt wrong after so many years in scrubs, her shoulders somehow smaller without the weight of a hospital badge clipped to her chest. 23 years. She'd walked these corridors as an enlisted nurse, a petty officer 3rd class, a senior chief, a master chief. She'd trained residents, mentored new nurses, caught diagnostic errors that saved lives. She'd done it all quietly, the way she'd learned to operate, move through the world without taking up space, solve problems before they became crises, save people who would never know her name. The box on the locker shelf contained 7 pairs of compression socks, a coffee mug with a faded navy anchor, and 2 paperback mystery novels she'd never opened. She reached for the back corner where she kept the coin, the tarnished challenge coin from Fallujah, the one Commander Hayes had pressed into her palm that day in the dust as medevac rotors shook the ground beneath them. His blood had been on her hands then. His weight had been on her shoulders. Now his name was tattooed on his forearm in block letters that spelled out gratitude he wouldn't remember. She heard the lobby doors open with their hydraulic sigh, the sound like a tired breath, like the hospital itself was sighing at the injustice happening beneath its roof. Security's radio crackled. Footsteps. Running. Multiple voices. A boy's voice. Cracking with emotion. Where is she? Elena's hand stopped moving. That timber. That particular break in the last syllable. That was Miguel, her son. 17 years old and supposed to be at Lincoln High in AP Chemistry, not here, not now. She turned toward the sound. Miguel stood in the main lobby wearing his father's old navy dress whites, altered carefully at the shoulders, hanging on his lean frame like borrowed dignity, and he was holding a shadow box. The glass caught the overhead light and threw it back in sharp angles. Inside, mounted on blue velvet with military precision, was a ribbon bar that Elena recognized with the force of a fist to her chest, a Navy Cross. 2 bronze stars. Master Chief Petty Officer anchors. Her anchors. Her medals. My mom needs to see these, Miguel said, his voice carrying across the lobby with the kind of clarity that comes from absolute certainty. Everyone needs to see these. Dr. Caldwell materialized beside the information desk, his jaw tightening, his entire face taking on the expression of a man watching his carefully choreographed destruction suddenly go off script. He had planned this moment differently, Elena leaving quietly, her reputation already shattered by his fabricated documentation, her credibility so thoroughly poisoned that nobody would believe her if she ever spoke about the supply contract fraud. Instead, his audience had tripled. Hospital staff were turning, coffee cups suspended halfway to lips, eyes tracking the boy with the shadow box. Elena moved toward her son. No tremor. No hurried steps. Just the measured pace of a woman who had walked out of Fallujah on a fractured leg, who had applied a tourniquet to her own thigh and kept walking, who understood that composure was its own kind of authority. The security guard who had been escorting her, a man named Patterson, probably 62, with weathered hands and the posture of someone who'd served, stepped directly in front of her path. I need to see the patient, Elena said. Room 347. Patterson turned to look at her. Really look at her. Not the fired nurse in civilian clothes. Not the woman Caldwell had reduced to a cautionary example during grand rounds. Something shifted in his face like a door opening in a long-closed room. Master Chief Petty Officer Martinez, Patterson said. His voice had changed. It carried the weight of recognition. 3rd Fleet. 2009, you trained Delta Platoon in maritime hostage rescue. He stepped aside. It wasn't a request. It was an act of restitution. The lobby had gone quiet enough to hear the rain starting outside, a soft percussion against the skylights, the kind of sound that makes people think about survival and small mercies. Caldwell's face had begun the transition from control to something else. Panic had an odor. Elena could smell it coming off him like cologne, acrid and chemical. A rear admiral came down from the cardiac unit, Admiral Hendricks, visiting a colleague on the third floor, happening to be stepping out of the elevator at precisely the moment when a boy in dress whites held up a shadow box. Hendricks had probably commanded 2,000 sailors in his career. He knew the look of authentic medals. He knew the weight of what a Navy Cross meant. "May I?" Hendricks asked Miguel, gesturing to the shadow box. Miguel handed it to him with the care of someone presenting a holy relic. Hendricks opened his mouth and read the citations aloud, his voice filling the lobby like authority made audible. For extraordinary heroism in connection with combat operations against hostile forces in Iraq. He paused. "Read on." The room had accumulated people, 40 of them now, maybe more. Nurses. Doctors. Housekeeping staff. Orderlies. A chaplain. A woman from billing with her hand over her mouth. Demonstrating exceptional courage, leadership, and disregard for her own safety. The Admiral's voice didn't waver. Navy Cross. 2 Bronze Stars. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, United States Navy. Retired. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old milk. His hands had curled into fists that looked less like weapons and more like fists around something he was losing: power, reputation, the ability to control this narrative with fabricated documents and golf course favors. The elevator doors opened again. Commander Hayes came out in a wheelchair, pushed by a nursing aide, and for the first time since the IED blast in Fallujah, the blast that had fractured his skull, destroyed the neural pathways for long-term memory, left him trapped in an island of perpetual present moment. His eyes held clarity. His hands were steady. His jaw was set. Someone had briefed him. Someone had explained what he needed to do. He raised his left arm. The tattoo was faded now, 6 letters in block capitals, Elena. Below it, in smaller text, Fallujah. The room's silence became absolute, the kind of silence where you can hear the refrigeration units in the nurse's station humming, where you can hear your own heartbeat like a second voice inside your skull. "She took shrapnel in 2 places, dragging me half a click to the extract bird," Commander Hayes said. His voice was quiet. Not weak. Quiet with the precision of someone finally finding words that mattered. "I'm only breathing because she wouldn't stop." Someone started clapping. 1 person, then 2, then the sound multiplied like rainfall on water. Elena watched her son's face, watched him realize that the world had just realigned itself, that his mother was suddenly visible in a way she had never been, that whatever shame he'd carried about her termination had been instantly converted into something else. Pride. Vindication. Truth. Caldwell moved toward the exit. The Admiral stepped directly into his path with the kind of physical authority that comes from command, from having made decisions that affected thousands of lives, from understanding that the abuse of power in a hospital is the abuse of power everywhere. Hendricks didn't speak. He simply stood there, blocking the way, making sure every person in that lobby watched Dr. Caldwell understand that he had lost. Elena knelt beside the wheelchair. Hayes's eyes tracked hers, and something flickered in them, not memory, but recognition of a kind that transcended neural damage. Muscle memory in the autonomic nervous system. The way the body remembers when the mind cannot. "Welcome back," she said. Hayes reached out and gripped her hand with the force of a man who'd been drowning and had just found surface. "I remember your voice," he said. "I remember. Combat. A woman screaming at me to keep moving. Your voice." The rain outside had intensified, hammering the windows like applause that wouldn't stop. Elena stood, turned to face the crowd of 40 people, and saw herself reflected in their eyes, not as the woman Caldwell had tried to erase, but as what had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to become visible. A Master Chief. A warrior. A nurse who had refused to let 5 doctors declare someone dead when she could still fight. "I'm going back to work," Elena said. No elaboration. No justification. The statement hung in the air like a command that had already been obeyed. Caldwell's phone rang from his pocket. His attorney. his world collapsing into legal discovery and fraud investigations and the permanent suspension of his medical license, consequences that had been set in motion the moment a decorated army surgeon in Boston received an alert about a viral video and understood that one of his former students had betrayed the fundamental oath that physicians take. But that would come later, in pieces, over hours and days. Right now, Caldwell was just a man standing in a hospital lobby watching his reputation evaporate like water on hot pavement. Elena looked at her son. At the shadow box with her medals. At the commander in the wheelchair with her name on his arm. At the admiral. At Patterson, the security guard who had served under her, who had never forgotten her name. "Let's get to work," she said. The next 3 hours were a blur of forms being reinstated, access cards being reissued, the CNO personally walking Elena back to the 7th floor with an expression of profound regret. By evening, Dr. Caldwell's emergency hearing before the California Medical Board had already been scheduled. By the next morning, the state audit of medical supply contracts had revealed $340,000 in fraudulent billing, the exact discrepancies Elena had documented and which Caldwell had tried to suppress by destroying her credibility first. 6 months later, Elena stood in the main lobby of St. Michael's in her navy dress whites, the same whites her son had borrowed, the same floor where she'd been fired and then vindicated. The hospital had established the Martinez Clinical Excellence Award for nurses who demonstrated courage in patient advocacy. Caldwell was teaching CPR to people who would never know his name, in a community college 70 miles away, earning $18 an hour, his medical license permanently restricted. The commander, fully recovered and returned to limited duty, stepped forward and pinned her credentials to her uniform himself. Miguel stood beside her in his rock dress uniform, a Naval Academy appointment already secured, already sworn in. The tarnished challenge coin from Fallujah was mounted in a glass case outside the ICU now, beside her Master Chief anchors and a plaque that read, "Never quit. Never surrender." Elena looked at the photograph mounted beside the coins, her in Fallujah, covered in dust and blood, carrying a man's weight on her shoulders, her face set in the exact same expression she'd worn when she'd stood in this lobby and refused to break. Admiral Hendricks shook her hand. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," he said. Elena didn't answer. She just turned back toward the ICU entrance where a patient was waiting, where lives were still being held in the balance, where her real work, the classified intelligence operation that had identified the Fallujah leak, the documentation of fraud that was climbing toward federal charges, the quiet leadership that was already changing how St. Michael's trained and valued its nurses, was only beginning. She was a master chief. She was still investigating. She was still saving lives. And now, everyone knew exactly who she was. Did this story hit you the way it should? Subscribe for more documentaries about the quiet warriors nobody sees coming, the ones with nothing left to lose, the ones who refuse to break. Like this video if you believe nurses deserve better. Comment below, what would you have done in Elena's position? And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever watched someone lose everything and then suddenly find themselves again, share your story. We're listening.